Once I was there, during army exercises, it happened at a training ground where, as it were, depicted as an Arab settlement, well, there are quite a few of them. Polygons, from Tselim, where an almost full-fledged city has been built, to here, smaller, and there. A house like this was built, reminiscent of Arab buildings. And so I saw with my own eyes how a bulldozer, an army bulldozer, the very same famous D9, it just drove right through it, going straight ahead without slowing down, and just went right through that building. In general, these are the Israeli Army bulldozers D9. This is the Caterpillar D9, also known as D9R, also known as Deti, also known as Sheon tube. Whatever they are called, in the Israeli army they form a very unimportant component of the Israeli ground forces. They belong to the engineering corps, but in principle they constantly participate in combat operations. I must say this is quite an unusual use of this equipment. And so, as I promised, today in this video I will tell you what kind of machine it is, what it is used for, how it is used, and what advantages it gives. In combat operations in the Israeli army, and overall why they started to use them. Hello everyone, my name is Sergey Auslender and you're on my channel. Please don't forget to support this video, like, subscribe, comment just like usual. Turn on notifications, hit the bell next to the video, click it. You can help the channel financially by donating for our regular sustainable work. This is a button, super thanks. 2 platforms, Boosty and Patreon. And you can become a sponsor of the channel on YouTube. All of this is very helpful, very important. And a huge thank you to everyone who does this. In general, the Caterpillar D9 is a bulldozer of American manufacture. Just now, the first thing Trump did when he came to power, when he went to the inauguration, was lift the ban on the delivery of a batch of these bulldozers to the Israeli army. Because the first thing Biden did was to ban that delivery, since they are destroying houses in Gaza and so on. As if it makes any difference whether this house is destroyed by a bulldozer or this house is destroyed by an artillery shell fired from a 155mm howitzer made in the United States, a shell produced at a factory in Michigan. Right. Well, it doesn't matter. We're not going to talk about that now. Biden is history. There's Trump, the bulldozer. And they supply a big batch worth $700 million, but that's not the point. In general, in the 1950s, the first models appeared. Among the lineup of these tractors, or rather bulldozers, the Caterpillar is one of the heaviest. There is the D11. It's the biggest one among them, and then there's the D9, which is the next one. In this hierarchy, he's quite large, 49 tons. It has a weight of army bulldozers, have a greater weight than armor. But we'll talk about this separately now. And he has very high, operational characteristics. It has a low operating cost. It has high reliability. And this is the power, such incredible power, that allows this bulldozer to perform combat tasks literally right next to it. With armored vehicles, along with armored vehicles. And she did all this. D9, or D9, they are called. Well, in one word, D9, yes. That's what made them like that. Well, it's a very important machine for the ground forces of the Israeli army. Well, now, a version called D9R is used, and its weight is tons along with the armor. And it has an engine with almost 500 horsepower. It even has a crew of 2 people. There is a driver and there is a commander, like in a bulldozer tank, which apparently shows to the driver where to go. Actually, these bulldozers, the earlier D9 models, first arrived in Israel in the 1960s for construction. They helped build there. With their help, they were digging something up. But then another war happened. This was during the so-called Suez Crisis. And the Israeli army had a problem with engineering vehicles. They were simply confiscated. Civilian bulldozers were taken into the army. And it turned out that these D9s, in particular, they work perfectly well. And during Operation Peace for Galilee, that is accordingly, 1981, the First Lebanon War. In this operation, bulldozers played a direct role, being already standard units, so to speak, in the Israeli army. They were paving roads for vehicles, clearing debris. They made engineering barriers, set up positions. There was a lot of work for them. But the problem was that they weren't armored at that time. These were ordinary civilian bulldozers that had been repainted, here in camouflage color, in the characteristic olive, the color that Israeli military equipment is painted in. And it turned out that they needed to be armored because they could be hit even by small arms fire. Well, I mean the cabin. And that's when they started to develop a whole program for their armor. A whole program was developed for this. Two companies received the contract: IWI, Israel Weapon Industries, which is the Israeli military industry, and Israel Aerospace Industries, the Israeli aviation or aerospace industry. They developed this program. Initially, the armor only protected the cabin, where the driver sat, the engine compartment, and the hydraulic unit. So, I mean, the vital components of the machines. Then gradually, when in 2000 they adopted the D9R into service, they developed new armor for it. That was all in the year 2000, early 2000s. And an additional 15. They added tons of armor to this bulldozer, which brought its weight up to 65 tons. In fact, it was impossible to hit this bulldozer with anything at that time, except for cumulative anti-tank grenades or cumulative anti-tank missiles, or which they had. At that time, the terrorists didn't have them in large quantities, and that's why these bulldozers became relatively invulnerable. From the small arms fire that the Palestinian terrorists had in large quantities, they were protected almost 100%. But later, this company IAA, which is Aerospace Industries, developed a counter-cumulative screen called Sulamot, which they added to this bulldozer, and accordingly it protected against the impact of cumulative grenades from RPGs. It's clear that if you hit such a bulldozer with a missile from the Cornet system, for example, or two, then most likely it would hit it. But against RPGs, which was the main heavy weapon of the Palestinian terrorists, it was pretty well protected. In addition to that, its weight and armor, including from the underside, protected it from explosions, from explosives. One of the most important functions of these bulldozers became mine clearance. And this mine clearance, if anyone has noticed, here are some footage from, let's say, Jenin. Right now, there's a military operation going on there. It's moved into a slightly different phase, but at the beginning of this phase, bulldozers are entering the city, literally cutting through the asphalt. That's because explosive devices are planted under the asphalt in advance by the terrorists, the Palestinians, and so they cut the asphalt so that army jeeps don't blow up. These explosive devices, so one day a 500-kilogram explosive went off under one of the D9R bulldozers. So in equivalent terms, it was almost 500 kilograms, half a ton of TNT. The bulldozer survived and the driver and crew survived as well. This speaks to its very strong resistance to the impact on it. The shockwave to the impact of the explosion. Basically, yes, and to the impact on it. Various types of explosive devices, including bombs. One of the first impressive uses of these bulldozers was during the defensive shield operation in Homat Magan. It took place in 2002 across the entire West Bank, meaning all of Judea and Samaria. And there was a moment when in Jenin, in that infamous refugee camp, 13 Israeli soldiers were killed. They were ambushed because there were terrorists in the houses that overlooked the street. It became clear that something needed to be done about these houses. The commanders called in the bulldozers, and the bulldozers simply demolished those houses. Meanwhile, the terrorists were fiercely shooting at these bulldozers, but they couldn't penetrate them. And this is how this so-called protocol was born. It's called sirlakats, which means pressure cooker. It's a gradual increasing firepower directed at a target, in this case, a house where terrorists are located, with the aim of either forcing them to surrender or to destroy them. The last point of Sirlakats is for the D9 bulldozer to drive through the house. This is exactly what I saw back then during the exercises, when the bulldozer, raising its bucket, just drives straight ahead like this, going right through the house. And accordingly, quite often, when D9 appears, terrorists prefer to surrender because they understand that they will be buried under the rubble. And since then, they have been used quite often. Well, actually, since then, these bulldozers have been used almost everywhere. There, for example, in 2008, they were used during Operation Cast Lead, when they literally paved the way. Military armored vehicles, clearing them of mines and explosive devices. They were used in 2014. They were used, I saw them with my own eyes. Such limited use in the Gaza Strip when I used to go there. Foreign correspondent, when I was there, I saw such limited operations. In the area of Beit Hanun, where these bulldozers were crawling under the cover of tanks, they were smashing and breaking things. There were several instances when the bulldozer crew literally engaged in combat. They saw the terrorists and understood that no one would make it in time. You can't just approach the building quickly with infantry or tanks. They just demolished the house and buried the terrorists under the rubble. In general, there were many such episodes. And this experience was actively applied later by the Americans, particularly in Iraq, when the Americans were fighting in Iraq. Yes, they used this accumulated Israeli experience, which is where it all came from. Yeah, this is the story. Because you're fighting in a densely built-up area where everything around is made up of houses, you need that kind of equipment, a tank. The building could theoretically collapse, but it could be damaged in the process. Weapons, guns, machine guns, everything that's mounted on top of it. All of that can get severely damaged and so on. And that's exactly what the bulldozer is designed for. In such areas like, say, the Jenin refugee camp, where the construction is very dense and chaotic, it's practically the perfect weapon for operating there. Usually, these bulldozers operate together with infantry. The infantry moves behind, while the bulldozer is in front and it has communication with them and so on. However, this has been talked about for a long time, but it turned out that it really is. They were developing remotely controlled bulldozers. Ram Ashar, which could be translated as Thunder's Dawn, or Thunder of Dawn. That's probably how you can translate that name. Or Black Thunder. It's also referred to in foreign sources, Black Thunder. This is also a type drones with remote control. For quite a long time, nothing was reported about them. But later on, they started writing that the army was gradually beginning to adopt them. These are the kinds of drone bulldozers. So it's a remotely controlled bulldozer with no crew at all. Somewhere there, an operator controls it from behind and, in fact, performs all the same tasks, but without risking lives. By the way, this Black Thunder or Ram Shahar still has the option for driver control. So they don't create a completely separate bulldozer for this. They adapt the existing machines for remote control. Inside, the corresponding modules are installed there. This development is still considered relatively secret. Basically, these bulldozers are used not only, of course, in combat conditions, but for example, when there was a fire on Mount Carmel in Haifa, which is a very well-known story. I remember it clearly. Back then, I broke my leg inside a firefighting plane, but I was after treatment. My leg was still there. It's weak, not overgrown. In general, I fell there. It was an absolutely nightmarish story. Well, forget about it. All right, just an unpleasant episode from my tumultuous biography. But those bulldozers were involved in extinguishing those fires because there was a moment when the fire was getting dangerously close to populated areas. And the bulldozers were creating these. They created fire breaks, clearing away trees and digging up the ground to cut off the fire from the populated areas. These were indeed army bulldozers. They were quickly deployed there, and they also participated in extinguishing those fires, especially considering the specific terrain, which was quite challenging for fire trucks and so on to access. In short, the experience of using these bulldozers is recognized as extremely useful. They continue to be in service with the Israeli army. Israel constantly orders them. This is how we just observed this story with the previous administration banned a batch of bulldozers, and the current administration immediately allowed it. What's interesting, Israel bought them at its own expense, that is, they were paid for, but Biden slowed them down. just a little, to teach us a lesson. I believe that, unfortunately, this decision cost lives a certain number of Israeli soldiers. Unfortunately, overall, they will remain in service, but apparently they will continue to be upgraded to enhance their armor. Right now in Lebanon in particular, they participated during the combat operations in this war against Hezbollah during the ground operation. They will be developed. This is the unmanned, driverless direction of these bulldozers. Well, they will come up with some more features there. Maybe, I don't know. But there is no real replacement for this bulldozer. Moreover, the Americans, considering their experience, used the D7. So this model was like demonstrating easier and simpler because they are easier to transport. They were used in less hellish conditions than, say, our D9s. But now, considering the experience of the Israeli army with the war in Iraq and their long stay there, the Americans are also switching to the D9. There was even a moment when they took some of these bulldozers from us. When there was an invasion of Iraq, they were part of the bulldozers in Israel. They asked to borrow them, took them there to work, and then returned them back. So it turned out unexpectedly that a completely civilian vehicle, a bulldozer, turns out to be very useful for digging a ditch, including in combat operations. And the main thing is that its job is actually to save soldiers' lives. Well, that's exactly what this bulldozer does successfully. So there's actually a military specialty considered a combat role called a bulldozer operator, which is indeed classified as a combat specialty. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to support, and see you soon. Goodbye, everyone.